Hello, everybody. This is Janet Webster Jones, the founder of Source Booksellers. We are delighted to be a host to you this evening for this wonderful conversation on the great book, State on Freedom. It's perfect for us because we are a nonfiction book seller in Detroit, bookstore in Detroit, Michigan, and we've been selling these kinds of books for 33 years. So I'm going to turn it over now to my daughter, Allison, and she's going to do some introductions.
So thank everyone for being here with us today. First, we're going to hear from Professor Emeritus Charles Simmons, a lifelong activist, a professor of journalism and law at Eastern Michigan University, the co-founder of Hush House, Black World Museum and Leadership Training Institute for Human Rights here in Detroit. And so we're going to hear some words from him. And then right after that, we're going to start to have a conversation with Professor Dan Berger, who is a professor at Washington Battelle, probably not saying it right, University of Washington, the author of several books, but the one that you may be aware of is Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era, which won an award, the James A. Raleigh Prize in 2015. And he will be in conversation with the subjects of his book, Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons, an assistant professor of religion at the University of Florida. She's a civil rights activist serving as a member of both the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Nation of Islam. And Michael Simmons, who was also an organizer at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960s, and also together the subjects of this book. So Mr. Simmons has been a part of fair housing movements, anti-apartheid movements, and is tuning in from Philadelphia today. To be in conversation with him, we are delighted that Dr. Gloria Aneb House, a poet, essayist, a human rights activist, and a fellow SNCC alumni, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a lifelong educator. And so we want you to enjoy the conversation and celebrate this book. We have it online and in the store for purchase, and we'll be enjoying this conversation with you all. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Should I go now? Okay, sorry. Hello, brothers and sisters. I'm honored to be here, and thanks to Source Booksellers, are the best bookstore in the country.
That's right.
And I'm honored to be here with these giants, the Simmons, Gwendolyn, and Michael, who I've known for about 30 years, and my friend and sister Aneb, Gloria House, who's a giant in the struggle and in the culture. As I said, I met Michael at in Pasadena back around the early 1990s through the American Friends the Quakers organization. And I had heard of him, but I had never met him. And so we came face to face, and we've been close friends since then. And he invited me to be on his American Friends Committee on Eastern Europe. And that was my beginning of my journey on studying Eastern Europe. I didn't know any Black people who had that type of experience or access. And so it's a very important life for us to study, because it's a family institution that we're looking at here. And it reminds me of the Robert Williams and Mabel Williams family, which included their children and extended family, who took on giants in North Carolina and then globally. I think it's important because this family has covered the breadth and depth of civil rights and human rights, and the interconnection between the global and the local struggles for justice, and shows how we're all related and that we have a common mission and a common oppressor. It shows how ordinary people can make changes in their communities, make changes in the nation, and make changes in this planet as which is so much needed today as we face the possibilities of nuclear war and climate catastrophe. It'll take grassroots people right now to stand up and organize to make the changes that are necessary for peace and for building a new world. So this is a book that you must read, and it's a life that you must study. And I'm so happy to see this book circulating around the country and young people getting involved in this conversation. So thanks again for inviting me, and you all persevere in the great work that you're doing.
So thank you, BabaCharles. I think it's my turn, right, Allison? Yes, okay. Thank you, BabaCharles. Very useful opening comments to really situate our discussion this evening. Thank you, Allison, for the warm introductions. It's really wonderful to be a part of this circle. I feel it truly is like a movement family reunion. Happy to be in conversation with BabaCharles, who's a longtime friend and fellow co-worker in the Detroit movement, with Zoharah, whom I see once or twice a month anyway in our National Council of Elders meetings, and with Mike. I think last time I saw Mike was 2 or 3 years ago when he was in the city briefly, and I had a chance to visit with him. And Dan, I do remember our interview, 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, one big happy family this evening. I would like to congratulate Dan for writing this extraordinary book. It's a very useful book. You know, as a university teacher, I always look at everything and say, oh, could I use this in a course? Or which course would I use this in, right? It's that kind of book that I would definitely use in a course, because it says so much that other books don't say about what it's like to be a movement activist. This book represents Dan's immense effort to examine closely 6 decades of Zoharah's and Mike's revolutionary activism. What a long span of committed revolutionary struggle. We commend Dan for the work, and we also commend Mike and Zoharah for their willingness to review their lives in such detail, right? So that we get everything step by step, and how they were involved in this organization and this formation, and how all of the things were connected. And also working with Dan in that way meant a very high degree of vulnerability, which must have been uncomfortable sometimes, right? So thank you for all that. For me, what is really important about the book is that it examines the day-to-day rhythms, choices, sacrifices, insecurities, risks, disappointments, hardships, and rare victories that characterize a life of a freedom worker. And the book makes clear that this story is not about your conventional community service volunteer, though they're important, but no, this is not what we're talking about here. You know, those people might commit to carry out a task on a monthly basis or on an annual basis, specific thing they're going to do, but no, we're not talking about that. Here we're talking about 24/7, right? 24/7. So it's looking at the life of a revolutionary activist from the inside. And I think that's what's so special about this book. And it explains to people, it answers certain questions that activists get all the time, like, why are you always going to meetings? And why are your meetings so long? And who are those strange people you were with the other day when I saw you? Don't you ever have any fun in your life? Are you still dealing with that Black stuff? You recognize the questions, right? Organizers who have been involved know the questions that are raised about the life that's dedicated to revolutionary work, revolutionary organizing. This book reviews the important historic markers and organizations of the Black Power movement, while examining Mike's and Zoharah's roles as individuals in that movement, committed activists who were determined to do everything they could in many different political arenas of political life, to claim our human rights and to move people towards greater freedoms and a better quality of life. Their hearts and minds were indeed stayed on freedom, stayed on freedom. Such intensity and determination. So Dan writes in the beginning of the book, to stay on freedom is a constant, if uneven, process of reflection and reckoning. So this evening, we want to continue that process of reflection and get Dan and Mike and Zoharah to talk with us about the book and share their experiences. So I'm going to kick off the conversation by asking Dan to talk to us about the overarching concept that he had for the book, this stayed on freedom, this commitment to create, to bring into being greater freedoms by any means necessary, or with such, self-determination. Talk to us about how that idea came to you and how you see Zoharah's and Mike's lives as a constant search for Black power. Because Black power is the theme that threads through, throughout the book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that lovely opening and that lovely reflection on the book. And thanks so much to Allison and Janet at Source Booksellers for bringing us all together this evening. It's so lovely. What an honor. This book took about 7 years of active work to come together, but really is more than 23 years in the making when I think about your question, Dr. House, because I had not only the good fortune, but just the good luck to arrive at the University of Florida the same year that Zoharah arrived, me as a student, the same year that Zoharah arrived there as a professor. And so I met her in what was both of our first years, and was so excited to learn of her movement history, but also how she was connecting those experiences to the present. This was 2000, and the 2000 presidential election, so all eyes were on Florida, and to learn about histories of struggle for voting rights and sort of barriers to voting rights, while Florida was itself the battleground over democracy itself, really made a big imprint on me. And I think Zoharah was an advisor to a lot of the activism I was doing as an undergrad, but I was also struck by how so many of her experiences in Black Power movement were not reflected in the writings about the movement. And when I graduated and I moved to Philadelphia and I met Michael, and I had that same sort of realization, or that same sort of gnawing, itch, right? That we haven't captured the story. And so even though, there's a lot of really wonderful work on different aspects of the Black Power movement, I always kept thinking about their experiences because they cut across multiple organizations and they cut across multiple geographies. And I think that's the difference that a movement makes, right? It's not just one organization, it's not just one place, it's not just one time period, right? That kind of persistence, that dedication is something that I think they both exemplify so beautifully. And so they were always kind of in my mind as I would read other people's writings about, the arc of the movement, or everyone in the movement did this, or no one in the movement did that. And to really reflect on these lives, right, and on the sort of longer arc of commitment and dedication in the freedom struggle. And so it's been such a gift to be able to work on this project together.
So in conceiving of the book the way you did, you also could illustrate Black Power as something bigger and than most people. When most people say Black Power, they have very limited notion of what you're talking about, either specific organizations or specific aspects of the movement, right, that they can point to. But you were trying to illustrate something else here, and I was wanting you to really say to us what it was you were after.
Yeah. So
what is this stayed on freedom idea?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I talk about in the book the Black Power as both a movement and as a paradigm. And of course, those things are related, but they're not the same thing. And we could see, the movement had its heyday in the late 60s and early 70s, but the concepts of Black Power as a orientation to liberation and justice that is rooted in self-determination, that is rooted in coalition, that is a global sort of internationalist sort of project. It's something that, I think defines Black Power and certainly has defined Michael and Zoharah's lives. So I was really struck, Zoharah teaching in the religion department, has done a lot of work in Palestine and the Middle East. Michael, when I met him, was living in Eastern Europe. Right? I want to really understand how Black Power could bring Zoharah to Jordan, right? How Black Power could bring Michael to Budapest.
Got it.
And I think those politics that they brought with them, and those kind of exchanges that they had with people all over the world are what Black Power gives us.
Exactly. So Zoharah, Mike, and Charles, would you like to comment on this particular question or issue?
I would like to jump into the Roma era. What can you share about your Roma experiences for young people now that will show the linkage between these global and the local struggles?
Thank you for the opportunity to make a few comments. I want to thank all concerned for bringing us together like this. And so let me start there. And a particular shout out to our ASL interpreters. So having said that the Roma are people that we in this country call gypsies. Well, they also are called that in Central Europe, well, throughout Europe. But and my relationship with the Roma reality was that, and it goes back to points that Dan was making and Dr. House in terms of the concept of Black Power, that a synonym for Black Power could be that oppressed people taking control of their lives. And it could be Chicano power, it could be gay and lesbian power, it could be any number of dimensions in that regard. To that degree, I started working with Roma many years ago because in Eastern Europe, because their reality was so dire. Not that I was a savior, but I wanted to do what I could do to improve their conditions. And by improve their conditions, I mean share with them some of the organizing techniques that I'd learned in the US to see what was applicable in a totally different cultural environment. So it wasn't so much me being the savior, but me saying, look, these are some things that worked for us, some things that didn't work that might work for you, and let's sit down and see if we can come up with a plan. And that approach towards Roma is basically my approach in general in terms of working with oppressed people. And when I say oppressed people, I'm including myself in that formulation. But the thing I think that is so important about that, and also Zoharah's work, is that we allow the U.S. Media in particular, but just in general, to shape how we see our struggles, so that they try to make our struggle a narrow, parochial, local, not even national struggle.
Right.
And
Exactly.
And so I think that when we show that the concept of Black power resonates in communities that have no African Americans, then I think that we can challenge that notion and show that our struggle is truly an international struggle. The tools we use are applicable in many situations, and it's reciprocal because we also learn from the people with whom we're struggling.
Absolutely. So, Mike and Zoharah, the moment or the time in your lives when you first started to say, no, the political orientation that we have here in SNCC and in other aspects of the freedom movement in the South, it's not working for us. We're reaching for something else. We're reaching for something that allows greater self-determination and more inventiveness and imagination concerning what we can do and how we can build. I wonder if you would be interested in talking about that moment. It was a really important moment in SNCC as an organization, but it was not just that, but it was illustrative of what was going on in the movement in general, the reaching out to self-determination, saying no to all of the confines of the Southern movement as we found it, all of that. And I wonder if you'd be interested in talking about that a little bit for young organizers. What happened in that moment, how you began to see things differently and to push for a different way of organizing and for Black consciousness and Black power.
Well, first of all, I'll jump in. Thank you for first of all, the opportunity to be with you all tonight, and for that formulation. When you say the moment, I'm not sure there was a moment, probably many moments leading me toward questioning what it was we were doing in the movement. I think, the fact that I had gone to Mississippi for the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project and had been very involved in organizing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and what happened to the party in 1964 in Atlantic City at the Democratic National Convention was one of those wake-up calls, because when the Democratic Party, pretty much including, Johnson and all of the officials within the party, undermined the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and pretty much showed to me that the problem we were dealing with was not just in Mississippi or the South, that it extended well beyond that, and that we were up against something much larger, I think, than I understood as a person growing up in the Jim Crow apartheid South, and thinking that, well, if we just can get people registered to vote, if we can just organize this formation, we're going to be able to change things. And that was one of the wake-up calls. I think being in Atlanta as a part of the Atlanta project of SNCC, after having, spent 18 months in Mississippi, then spending a few months in New York City, and getting my first real taste of Black nationalism, was like a real eye-opener. And certainly once we formed the Atlanta project of SNCC, being with Michael and Dwight and Bill Ware and other members of the project, and us sitting and talking about our experiences and what we had learned from them, helped to crystallize this understanding that this was about self-determination. Absolutely. And that we had to basically change ourselves, as well as change the world, change certainly beginning in Atlanta and the United States. I don't think at that point I was thinking beyond the United States, but it was a developmental process.
Absolutely.
Unquestionably.
So Mike, maybe you could take up from there and then talk about how the internationalism, the perspective, and evolves. You said a little bit about it already, but maybe you could just follow up from where Gwen has just left off.
You're muted.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. That I should say that the international aspect of the African American freedom struggle has a long and rich history that predates us. That you can go back to Frederick Douglass. You can clearly Marcus Garvey, W. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Malcolm X. So that you cannot study African American history without looking at the world at any particular time. So I do want to say that, because I know for me, for an example, Malcolm X had a profound influence on my looking beyond the U.S. as in terms of trying to sort out what was going on in the U.S. So right. That's one thing. The other thing is, in terms of our contemporary, the Vietnam War, along with the Cuban Revolution, I think really had a profound impact on all of us. And for me personally, even though at the time I didn't understand it, the Algerian Revolution also
yes.
impacted. That there were things that I mean, when I talk about them now, it sounds like I knew then, but I didn't. But I look back on it. But the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Movement, I mean, all of those things tied directly into the African American struggle. At the time, I didn't see it all together the way that I do now, and the way that I began to see it. But clearly, the anti-war movement was one aspect of us looking internationally. And again, the Cuban Revolution was yet another that we saw. When you combine those realities with what Zoharah just said regarding our intense learning experience in 1964, that it was almost, I shouldn't say inevitable, but clearly logical that we would begin to look beyond our immediate environment and involvement. Because let me just say that, one of the things about Vietnam, and I used to say to whites who challenged African Americans, that like my view is that we saw Vietnam as linked to Mississippi, and many in the mainstream anti-war movement did not see that. But it was our view that everybody that supports our oppression in Mississippi supports the war in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
So that we saw that as a direct linkage. Everybody opposed to the struggles of the Cuban people support the war in Vietnam. That all these apologists for apartheid and colonialism support the war in Vietnam. So that we began to try to
make the connection,
ferret our way through that, to see just what these connections, these concrete connections were.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add a little bit to that, we talk about this in the book, but Michael and Zoharah met at a SNCC meeting in November of 1965, where they were both sort of on the same side of the debate of encouraging SNCC to adopt an anti-war statement that you, Dr. House, helped draft. And so that statement is directly linked to the Atlanta project of SNCC that Zoharah talked about, which is directly linked to the Black Consciousness paper and the kind of emergence of sort of Black Power philosophy, within SNCC. And so the internationalism is there from the beginning, right? The internationalism helps give rise to Black Power. And in fact, in the transcript of that meeting, Zoharah is talking, most of the conversations about Vietnam, but Zoharah is talking about the US invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965 and is talking about US support for apartheid South Africa. So just as Mike was saying, right, all of these things were linked, that Vietnam was Mississippi, not only because the same people were supporting them, but because the freedom movement was recognizing itself in those struggles around the world.
Absolutely. So I wanted to get to your work as staff and directors within the American Friends Service Committee. One of the things that your book does, Dan, is to show the tentacles of the Quakers all over the world, right? And I was going to try to draw a connection between the work as staff and director at AFSC to the evolving internationalism, or even the strengthening of your internationalist orientation. When you look back on having been on the staff with the Quakers for so long, what kinds of conclusions do you have? And do you have, from that experience, any advice or recommendation to young activists who work for major organizations or nonprofits or whatever, and how to deal with, the tensions that arise around cultural supremacy, racism, all of that? I know I'm putting everything into this question, right? It's one big ball of wax. So you can take whatever part of it you'd like to speak to.
Well, clearly there were many struggles within the American Friends Service Committee. I don't think they had a lot of Black people coming into the organization like people like me or Mike. We cut our teeth in the trenches in the Deep South and had developed, a Black consciousness and a whole notion of being people worthy of being listened to. And this was kind of new for the Friends, so we clearly had battles within that organization, and I think we moved them in good ways toward understanding what they profess to believe in. And then the AFSC was really very important for my own development, because the fact of it being an international organization focused on peace, international development, and civil rights here in the United States, meant that, they had staff, they brought people in from all over the world that we were able to hang out with. I'll never forget the Aborigines from Australia who lived with us for a time there in Philadelphia, and just to have them telling us about what their lives were like in Australia and how they had been hunted like animals and killed. And I mean, that was so eye-opening. And then to meet many people from South Africa who were in exile, learning about apartheid and meeting all these people from the Middle East and the Palestinians. And I mean, it was such a laboratory for expansion of one's consciousness, one's understanding of the world. So clearly, I'm very, very happy to have spent 23 years of my life in those experiences. Yes.
And you were traveling also, as well as receiving people. Yeah, right, traveling to those places.
I mean, and it's kind of interesting that I believe that I might have been one of the first African Americans that the Quakers sent on a peace delegation, because I learned later that there was some real debate about me being a part of the delegation that went to Vietnam at the end of the American invasion of Vietnam, and then to travel, from north to south on all the broken down roads and to see all the destruction that the United States had rained down on those people, and for them to show us what had been done, but also to show us how they resisted US invasions and all of that. And just to be to spend weeks with these people in very confined quarters of our little van that we were driving around in.
Right.
And then to go to Cambodia and to be the first, Americans to enter Cambodia after the Vietnamese had routed Pol Pot, and to see the killing fields, and to learn what had happened there. And, to go to the Middle East on a couple of Quaker delegations for peace. I mean, all of these things were so eye-opening and helping me to understand that the struggle was an international one.
The global struggle, right?
White supremacy, colonialism, war, etc. So it was a great set of experiences.
I think we're probably getting close to the end of our time, and we want to hear from folks in the audience, but I would like Michael to talk, since this is the last question. What do you say to young activists now? I smiled when I read in the book, oh, I've gone to India, here's racism. I'm in China, here's racism. I'm in the Soviet Union now amongst all these communist comrades, and here is racism again. And here they are condescending to me again and trivializing the conversation that they're having with me rather than talking policy with me. So all of those experiences, and I know you processed them because you stayed in the movement. You figured out a way to deal with them. So maybe some comments that might be useful to young organizers, young activists dealing with, the pervasiveness of racism, cultural supremacy everywhere, and nevertheless doing the work that we have to do.
Well, that's a big order. Let me.
Well, when you comment, we'll then go to see what the audience is thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing is, and I say that it's probably more relevant today for the gay, lesbian, trans movement than it is for African Americans. But don't let people trivialize you. One, and that you have a right to define reality based on your terms, so that, as I mentioned earlier, people in the mainstream peace movement would tell me, that I couldn't see it as a linkage to the domestic movement. And my position was that we were more advanced. We could, and now everyone can see it. That I think that people, young organizers, need to recognize that Zoharah and I in the most positive sense of the formulation are ordinary people, and that the movement sometimes puts us in a situation to do things that we could never imagine doing in the abstract. And without going into some of the things, I hope you read the book. But there are things that I read about in terms of myself, where it's like, man, you out of your mind. But at the time, it seemed like the most logical thing to do, to try to adjudicate a situation. I say that to say that many people are going to suggest to you, young folks, that you're out of your mind, that you ought to be doing this. Why are you doing that? Why are you doing it? And you need to have a firm commitment of your vision and a firm sense that that what you see can be changed. And to that degree, I want to end it up by saying is that any time you organize, you need to think about it, that you are trying to create a new reality for everyone. That organizing is not to figure out how to find people's oppression more palatable. It is to challenge that oppression and to create a new reality. And when you create that new reality, that like you have no idea what's going to happen out of that, and that each new reality creates new other realities.
Regenerates, right? Exactly.
So to that degree, I think that is important for people to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Mike and Zoharah, Dan, BabaCharles. So I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. Allison, do we have questions from the audience?
I have another while we wait on them.
Oh, no questions yet. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, Baba.
For Sisters Zoharah and Michael, what more do you think that we can do now to enhance the struggle on any level, given what we're up against, these multiple monsters on all fronts? I know that you're in you're with the elders along with Aneb. What are you thinking about this?
Well, if I can just jump into that question, and it's a difficult one, and I'm happy to be working with Aneb and so many of the elders from all of the movements of the 60s and 70s, as we really try and figure that out, as we work with the young people who are the activists on the front lines. And we're really happy to be working with them, sharing our experiences as well as learning from them. Because, what you did in 1964, you may not be able to do in 2023, certainly not in the same way you did it.
Right.
But one of the things that certainly has been my experience, and I've always been a part of some formation, so some organization. And so I think I was extremely blessed that it was SNCC to begin with, and learning how to hold an organization together, even though, clearly that's a hard thing to do. And all the other formations that I've been in, I would say to young people that you must build organizations, and that these organizations should be independent as much as possible, and that you have to work at developing a deep understanding of what we're up against in the world, as well as strategies for change, ways to support each other and keep each other going, because this is a long distance, struggle we're engaged in. And so, 6 decades later, clearly I didn't expect to still be keeping my hand on the freedom plow, as we said in the SNCC Women's book, that this was still going to be necessary, to be organizing, to be understanding what it is we're up against and developing strategies for addressing these horrendous problems. And now we're facing climate catastrophe. We're facing World War III and a possible nuclear confrontation, in addition to the fact that, we have extreme poverty, we have a criminal justice system that is completely out of control, and all of the thousands upon thousands of people who are incarcerated in horrible conditions. I mean, we all know on this call what the problems are, and how we address those problems will require our best minds, our best intentions, and a commitment to people. Because, I think we made some mistakes that we really need to learn from. And not keeping organizations together that were independent of a political party, of, NGOs fundings and all
Corporations funding, exactly.
Corporations funding. We really must have independent organizations that we control, and that we develop these strategies through and with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Allison has a question.
Yes. This is from Maria Binbo. Given so much that was happening during the time, still happening now, how did you find balance in your personal lives?
Can't say that I did.
Looks as if Michael's ready to.
No, I'm not really. I've never, there is no answer to that, really. You just live your life. I mean, well, I don't have an answer for it. Let's put it that way. Everybody, no matter what endeavor, you have to, feed yourself. You got to pay rent. If you have children, you got to deal with that. All those things happen to all of us. And you just have to find a way. I mean, one of the things that and the approach is different for everyone. While I was concerned about bills, et cetera, but making money was never a big goal of mine, beyond just having enough to deal with my necessities and maybe a little bit for some playtime. But basically, big salaries were not a big deal. Now, that doesn't suggest, though, that for some, their wants are larger than mine. So then they do things to get more resources to themselves. That doesn't say that they don't have the same commitment as myself, but it may limit their things that they're willing to do and not do. The point that I'm making is that it takes all kinds to make a social movement. That I realize that people aren't necessarily going to follow in my footsteps as I led my life. But what I hope they do is to look at where they are at in their reality and try to improve that. Because that's the one thing that I tell people when they ask me, well, what should I do? And I tell people, look, wherever you are, there's a contradiction. In your neighborhood, somebody's getting ripped off. In your city, somebody's getting ripped off. So wherever you're at, you can pick and choose almost.
There's a struggle right in front of your face.
And that is my point to people, is you don't have to start out changing the world. You can start out by changing your block, your school, and the world will come to you. I believe.
I would just add a little bit that question was very much on my mind throughout this book, because when I began the book, I was a new parent, and so I was, my ability to be involved in some of the sort of political work that I had been doing was different than it had been. So I really wanted to learn from different sort of movement elders and veterans how they did that, and too many books and approaches to political struggle just assume that people don't have personal lives or don't have kids or don't have, they don't get married, they don't get divorced, right? Everyone is just like a perfectly formed leader, right? Or like a perfectly formed, political subject. And of course, that's not true. And so what I really wanted to write a human book about what it means to be involved in the struggle for the long haul. And I mean, both Zoharah and Michael sort of alluded to this, but like, the book is not a blueprint in that regard. There are lots of mistakes that happen, right? There are lots of times when they didn't take care of themselves or their relations in ways that didn't work out. So the book is not just a happy-go-lucky story in that regard. But I think recognizing, as Michael said, right, wherever you are, there's and as you said, Dr. House, like there's a struggle in front of you, right? There's a struggle that's already happening, and how do we sort of be and bring our full selves within that struggle?
And I think, as I said earlier, that's one of the reasons this book is so useful and so important, that it does open up that aspect of a movement worker's life to people so they can understand. Right. Yeah.
We have one question waiting first.
Oh, if I could just add, I think that it's very important, and this has been an important part of my life, is, learning about how to take care of yourself health-wise, and hopefully being in groups that also are interested in learning how do we take care of ourselves in terms of what we eat. Herbs and other things have been a big part of me attempting to stay healthy and able to continue in the struggle, and also a spiritual practice. This is not something that everybody might need, but I clearly needed that, and always was looking for some spiritual answers to larger questions. And so that's also been a very important part of my being sustained over all these decades.
So maybe one last question here. This is Rich Feldman. My question is, our generation and the American people have lived under racial capitalism for another 60 years. What does it mean to struggle against our internalization of values and contradictions? Relationship between internal state enemies and external enemies and contradictions. It's really hard to type on Facebook.
Okay. All right. So, Allison, do you want to read that question one more time?
Sure. The question is that the American people, or this generation, has been under racial capitalism for 60 years or so. But what does it mean to struggle against our internalization of values and contradictions? So they're not like fresh contradictions, I guess what he's trying to say. So how to struggle between the relationship between the external state enemy and internal enemies.
Okay. I guess he means internal, like within the organizations where we're working or whatever. Okay. All right. So here's our final question of the evening. So we're not calling on anyone. We're just going to see who wants to step up.
Let me just say, just take a piece of it anyway, that well, one, racial capitalism is more than 60 years old. Let me just start off there. I think we could
first correction, right?
We could talk about the foundations of this country, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of racial capitalism. But that question suggests something to me that that I have been thinking about on this book tour, and that is how we look at our movements, because we progressive people of all races are dealing with some major obstacles in terms of our goals, in terms of, well, I mean, we're dealing with state power, municipal power, international institutions, etc. And that quite often we look at our social movements and a lot of people throw their hands up and say, wow, we didn't get this done and get that done. And I would argue that people have a very narrow view of how social movements evolve. And I would take the recent George Floyd as but one example of that, because I've heard people say, well, we did all that and and nothing has happened and there are no changes, but there are changes. They're not the changes that
Absolutely. Perception.
And it's not that we can stop, but what happened in Memphis and when they locked up those officers was a result of the George Floyd protests. Or somebody tell me when you've ever seen that happen in the context of police repression. What just happened in Richmond, Virginia yesterday, when they killed that brother in a prison mental institution. And they locked up the perpetrators of that too was a result, I would argue, of the George Floyd movement. But let me just step back and just mention one thing that came up yesterday when I was on a protest demonstration about banks and the environment here in Philadelphia. And I met an old prison comrade of mine, and he was talking about a new documentary that's going to appear on, I presume, PBS. I know the local station, but it talks about the Nixon era, and it talks about when Nixon first became president, his plan was to just do an all-out assault on Vietnam, North and South, threaten nuclear weapons, and to really try to create an image of himself as a madman in order to create fear in the Vietnamese that would push them to the conference table. And to make a long story short, the reason why he didn't do that was because of the peace movement, because they were concerned that him doing that would just accelerate the peace movement. Now, we never knew this. I never knew it. I mean, so I'm just saying is that there are so many ways to assess the success of social movements,
struggle, right?
Even when you lose. So that people should really try to really take the long view, looking at social change, because it's not going to happen in the short time.
Right.
And look more closely at everything. Yes. Zoharah, you were going to say
something? Chiming on to what Michael has said, those of us in the National Council of Elders have been every April 4th doing events for a number of years around Dr. King's breaking silence speech that he gave on April 4th, 1967. And of course, in that speech, amongst the just incredible things that he said was, that the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And as importantly, he talked against the triple evils of materialism, militarism, and racism. And so when the person who put the question forward talked about the internalization of racial capitalism, or I would think that it's materialism. And this is something that I think we in the movement for progressive social change have to really speak out against, because, one of the reasons that we're in the state that we're in is that, you've got billionaires ripping off the people And they are the ones who fund many of our politicians who really answer to their needs and wants as opposed to the needs and wants of our people. So that the whole question of materialism is definitely something that we have to, I believe, speak out against. And so that anybody who thinks it's okay to do anything you want to do to make money and have no regard for people's needs and wants and lives, you know, this has to be challenged. And of course, King called for a revolution of values. And I think we, in today's movement, have to be very clear that, you know, we are about social change, and I certainly am about socialism, so that people's needs are met, and there's no need for there to be billionaires taking up 10, 20, 30% of the resources of this country, which is what's happening, if not more. So I think that revolution in values is something critically needed in our struggles today.
Great note to end the conversation on. There's so many things that we could have covered. The book brings up so many things that are important. For example, the whole struggle around political prisoners, you know, the question of abolition of prisons, and Mike and Zoharah have been involved in all of those movements as well. So that's the reason you have to read the book, because we've only been able to cover just a tiny bit of the reflection and reckoning in this evening's conversation. So I'll turn the mic over to Allison.
We're back. First of all, thank you so much, panel, for your deep insights, your open thinking, your work over the years. And I have to confess, I'm probably in the elderhood crowd too. And so many of the things that you speak about are things that I certainly conform to myself. So thank you, each of you, for being here and for coming together electronically like this, which I call the 21st century magic that lets us be with each other across these many lines. And to Dan, thank you for your book. Allison is going to now push it because
we're a bookstore, for goodness sake. But State on Freedom is available at Source Booksellers in store and online. It's also available with any indie bookstore if you're away from Michigan or away from Detroit. So we hope that you read every page and then reread it, because it's just that powerful. The history, the movement history, and just the history of the subjects of the book. So thank you so much, Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons and Mr. Michael Simmons. Thank you so much, Dan Berger, for bringing us all together, and Dr. House for being a fantastic moderator, and Professor Emeritus Charles Simmons for the special words and for being our special guest.
And Flo and Junie.
Yeah.
Okay.